Hi and welcome to AudioTutes.com. My name is Mo Volans and this is the second part in a series of screencasts about subtractive synthesis. In the last one, which was the first part, we used Subtractive from Reason to have a look at oscillators, filters and envelopes. In this section we're going to be looking at the mod envelope, LFOs and control mapping. In the last part, just looking at oscillators, filters and envelopes, we made this basic saw pad sound. It's quite a nice sound, but it's pretty basic, and in this section we're going to be looking at how to spice it up a little and give it some dynamics and interest. Now, simply put, a modulator is just something that changes our patch in some way. It might just change it once, or it might change it at several points over time. The most common modulators used in synthesis are envelopes, LFOs and external sources. Now we're going to look at each one of these in turn on Subtractor, and hopefully it'll make the whole subject a little clearer. As the last thing we looked at in section 1 of subtractive synthesis was the filter and amplitude envelopes in Subtractor, we're now going to look at the mod envelope. It's really just the same as the other two envelopes. It contains the same 4 basic controls: attack, decay, sustain and release, and also an amount knob and an inverse button. The only real difference is that it can be routed to several different destinations rather than being hardwired to the filter or the amplifier. As you can see, it can be routed to oscillator 1 and 2. This controls the pitch, the main mix, the frequency modulation, the phase of the oscillators, or the frequency of filter number 2. To show you this mod envelope in action, let's look at it modulating a few things that the other two envelopes can't touch. To demonstrate the mod envelope in action, I've dialed in some basic settings: a long attack, a long release, and decay and sustain are at full. And I've dialed in the amount at exactly 64, which is halfway. First of all, I've assigned it to oscillator 2. This will alter the pitch of only the second oscillator and leave the first oscillator static. These pitch effects are great for adding interest to a sound and making them sound a little quirky. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Now obviously you wouldn't want this in every sound, but sometimes this can work really well. Now let's have a listen to the same envelope settings with the same amount dialed in on some different parameters. Here it is on frequency modulation. And on phase. Phase is quite a subtle one, and it's quite nice as it gives a sort of chorus effect. So I'll leave it on that one for a bit of extra interest. But you can see that this can be pretty useful and add some real flair to a sound if there's something lacking. Now moving on, let's take a look at LFOs. LFOs are pretty much the most popular way of applying modulation in synthesis. You'll see 1 or 2 LFOs on most synths that you use, and Subtractor's no exception. There's 2 LFOs, one's a little bit more expanded than the other, but they both pretty much do the same thing. We're going to be looking at LFO 1. Now, as you can see, the destinations for modulation are quite similar than they are in the mod envelope. The only real difference is that we're using an LFO rather than the envelope as a modulation source. If we look down the left hand side, we can see a choice of waveforms. This is really similar to the oscillators we see in the main synth, and technically this is exactly what an LFO is. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it works in exactly the same way as a main oscillator. The only real difference is it doesn't actually make a sound. The waveform is only used to trigger and modulate and change different parts of the synth. You can see there's a rate control and an amount control that works in a very similar way to the amount control in the envelope. Just so you can hear it working, let's choose the first waveform, which is a sine wave. Let's choose oscillator 1 and 2 as the destination, and let's start dialing in some amount. When I play the sound, you should be able to hear this working. Now obviously that's pretty intense, and you're probably only going to use that for an effects patch, but you can actually apply vibrato using this method, as long as you use small amounts and fast speeds. Let's have another listen. So used subtly, this can be a really nice effect. It's also very useful for modulating the filter. Let's have another listen to this. Now currently we're using the LFO in a free mode where the rate isn't locked to any sort of tempo, but as you can see there's a sync button. When this is clicked, the rate control changes and shows us bar divisions and note divisions. This can be very useful for syncing to the project or syncing to a beat. Turning the sync off and going back to the sort of setting we had for the vibrato, let's make sure everything's right before we use it. Now that's great, but say we don't want the vibrato on all the time, and we only want the vibrato to come in when we program it using automation or a manual control. We would have to use an external controller. So I'll turn the amount down, and moving over to the external controller section, I'll turn the LFO amount up. Now when we move the mod wheel up, we can hear the vibrato come in. Obviously that's a little much, so let's turn it down to about 15–20%. This can give real expression and really add something to the sound during performance. Hopefully this tutorial has shed a bit of light on modulation for you and LFOs, and with a little practice you should really be able to add some life to your own patches.